Let me tell you about something that happened to a friend of mine, someone who doesn't talk about it anymore. When I first heard it, I thought it was just another urban legend, but the way they told it, I'll let you decide if it was real. This friend, let's call her Emily, inherited an old 2-story farmhouse about 2 years ago. It was her great aunt's, a woman she barely knew except for vague family stories about how she had been a recluse in her later years. The house was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods and the kind of isolation you'd only find if you got lost on purpose. Emily planned to sell it, but since the place had been abandoned for a decade, she decided to clean it up first. When she drove up for the first time, she immediately got a strange feeling. The house was leaning slightly, like it had given up on standing tall. The paint had long since peeled away, revealing gray wood underneath, and most of the windows were either cracked or missing entirely. But the worst part was the air, thick, heavy, and silent, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Emily brushed it off as nerves. She was practical, not someone who scared easily. She had a list of things to do and a limited amount of time to get them done. The first day was uneventful. She swept out years of dust and debris, opened the windows to let in some air, and explored the house. It was mostly what she expected: old furniture draped in sheets, peeling wallpaper, and creaky floors. But there was one room upstairs that felt different. It was locked when she tried the handle, and even though she found a set of old keys in the kitchen, none of them worked. That was odd, but she figured the door had swelled shut or something. She moved on. That night, Emily stayed in one of the downstairs bedrooms. It was freezing, despite it being late summer, so she piled on blankets and tried to sleep. That's when she first heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. Whispering. She sat up, straining to hear. It seemed to be coming from upstairs, though she couldn't make out the words. Convinced it was her imagination, or maybe the wind, she forced herself to ignore it and eventually fell asleep. But the next morning she noticed something strange. The door to that locked room upstairs was ajar, just slightly. Emily swore she hadn't touched it. When she pushed it open, the room was empty except for a small wooden rocking chair in the center. The walls were covered in scratches, not deep gouges, but long thin marks like fingernails had scraped against the plaster, over and over again. Still, she rationalized it. Maybe an animal had gotten in. Maybe the rocking chair was just forgotten. She told herself anything to keep going. She had work to do, and she wasn't about to let a creepy old house scare her off. That evening, things escalated. Emily had brought her laptop to watch movies and keep herself entertained. As she sat in the living room, the whispering started again, louder this time. It seemed to ebb and flow, like a conversation just out of reach. She paused the movie and strained to listen. The whispers were coming from the ceiling, directly above her, the locked room. She felt a cold sweat break out across her back, but told herself she wasn't going to be that person who ran away from some weird noises. She grabbed a flashlight and marched upstairs. The room was exactly as she'd left it earlier, empty except for the rocking chair. But now the chair was gently swaying, like someone had just stood up. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, shining her flashlight into every corner of the room. There was no one there. She didn't sleep much that night. When she finally dozed off in the early hours of the morning, she dreamed of the room. In her dream, the whispers were clearer, but they weren't in a language she understood. They sounded pleading, desperate. The next day she found something new. While cleaning out a closet in the hallway, she discovered an old leather-bound journal. The writing was faded and erratic, but from what Emily could make out, it belonged to her great aunt. Most of it was mundane: weather notes, recipes, complaints about the house falling apart, but the last few entries were unsettling. Her great aunt wrote about hearing them at night, about how they came from the walls and the woods, and how they never stopped. She mentioned the locked room, saying it was the only safe place because they couldn't get in there. The final entry was a scrawl of words, barely legible. "The whispers are angry. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to open it." Emily was rattled, but she wasn't ready to leave yet. She'd always thought her great-aunt had been eccentric, and she'd chalked it up to a lonely woman's imagination. That night, though, changed everything. She had just turned off the lights and was lying in bed when she heard footsteps above her. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth. Her blood turned to ice. No one else was there. She grabbed her phone and called a friend, whispering frantically for them to stay on the line while she investigated. As she moved up the stairs, the footsteps stopped. The locked room was open again. This time, the rocking chair wasn't empty. A figure sat there, hunched and shadowy. Emily froze, unable to breathe. The figure's head turned slowly toward her, and though she couldn't make out a face, she felt its eyes on her. Her phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. The next thing she knew, she was running. She didn't remember turning or leaving the house. She was just outside, sprinting to her car. She drove straight to a motel and didn't go back until the next day, with her friend and a few others in tow. The house was eerily silent when they entered. Everything seemed untouched, except for one thing. The journal was gone. Emily searched everywhere for it, but it had vanished. Her friends didn't believe her story. They joked about how she'd scared herself silly in an old, creepy house, but she swore she wasn't imagining it. In the end, she sold the property to a developer sight unseen. She didn't care what happened to it. She just wanted it gone. But sometimes, she said, she still dreams of the whispers. And every now and then, she'll wake up to the sound of footsteps pacing just above her bedroom ceiling.